hope this video finds you safe, and I know that this time is quite chaotic, and I wanted to clarify some questions that I've been getting after the email that I sent out on Monday concerning how to submit the paper and the presentation and in what format. You can just email both of those documents to me, a Word document for your paper and a PowerPoint for your presentation. I've extended the deadline for both of those to the end of the semester. We also got an email yesterday that has sparked a lot of questions from you, from the provost, concerning not only the extension for the course withdrawal deadline to April 17th, but also the option to switch your grading for the course to pass-fail. I'm going to leave that up to you, but if you've completed all the assignments and you're doing extra credit, there's really no need to switch to pass-fail. You'll do just fine. My intention with the email that I sent out to you was to make audio recordings to go along with the PowerPoint presentations, but I think that rather than doing that and making a giant file that you have to then download, I'm just going to make video presentations so that you can go back and review this material as many times as you want to, and all you have to do is click a link and go to YouTube. So with that being said, we'll move back into the lecture material, and we've just finished going over Chapter 7 on painting media, and Chapter 8 is referring to many different types of print media. So how many of you have made a print before or done any print making? I'm sure that you have in a digital sense, just thinking about printing out a picture or a paper that you're writing for class on a LaserJet printer. But in the case of printmaking, this is really the first time in history that we have the ability to make copies of things. So there was no Kinko's, there was no Xerox machines in the Renaissance period. What were you doing? You would make a matrix and then print it onto paper. So that's the first term that we're going over here, matrix. Not to be confused with The Matrix with Keanu Reeves, which, if you haven't seen that trilogy, now's probably a good time to go back and watch it because it's pretty amazing. But the matrix, in the case of prints, is any surface that you are preparing, whether you're applying ink to or carving into, to make a design onto a surface that can then be pressed onto paper. So the first one that we're going to go over, relief, is just like you think about with a rubber stamp. In that, you know how a rubber stamp works. There's raised areas, you press it into the ink, and then you press it onto the paper, and that transfers the design. So the same with this. In this case, we're using an ink roller to apply the ink to the surface, then apply pressure and transfer your design onto paper. Another term that you definitely need to remember as far as printmaking is concerned is the addition. So whenever you are additioning, you might have seen this sometimes when you go into a gallery and you look at work that's not an original painting but has a number at the bottom of it, a fraction in the bottom right hand corner. That is the addition. So it will usually be a number over another number, and that is referring to how many total prints were made. So if it says 100, there are 100 total, and the first number will be the number in order that that print was made. So in this case, you have 10 over 100, so it's the 10th print in a series of 100. If it said 4 over 50, you'd know that it was the 4th print in a series of 50 prints. So this is for rarity. You know that if you have something that's rare, like there's only a certain amount of them in the world, and this is letting collectors know that they have one of only, say, in this example, 100 prints. So that can be placed at the bottom to give you a little bit of information. You usually also have the title and the artist's signature there at the bottom along that bottom of the print to give you some more information. But with relief, this is the first one we're going to talk about. Relief is just like a rubber stamp. You can see that there are depressions that have been carved away, and then the ink itself is remaining on the top surfaces. So everything that's going to transfer from that matrix onto paper is on these raised areas. And sometimes it's done with wood. In that case, it'd be a woodcut. Sometimes you are using linoleum, and that is commonly referred to as a linocut. There's slight differences in these, mostly textural. Whenever we're looking at a woodcut, you can see in this one the person has had to change the direction of their carving, and that's because of the grain of the wood. If you're using linoleum, oftentimes you don't have to do that. You can switch directions with your carving tool and move however freely you would like to, because there's no wood grain. You're not going to run into little knot holes or inconsistencies in that material. We don't want to confuse this, however, with relief in sculpture. So as far as this goes, this term is going to come up in the next, or in chapter 11 when we get into sculpture, talking about relief carving. You can see with an image like this, you have created an image out of a flat surface, but if you took an ink roller and rolled it over this surface, what you're going to get is not the image when you transfer it onto paper that we see here. You might get some of the raised areas like the ears and the cheeks. They might transfer, but you're not going to get an exact copy of this image like you will with relief printing. With woodcut here, you can see in this example, you're still getting some of that wood grain texture that's being transferred, but everything that has been transferred into this image here with black ink was completely flat. So not the same as these surfaces that have curvature to them. This goes back quite a ways into our history at this point, definitely before the Renaissance. This one is coming from 868 CE from China, the Diamond Sutra. And this is one of the older prints that we have. And they were making copies of this text. As you can see, it also had images in it. But I want you to be able to see close up in this image itself that's in that text, which is very, very detailed. They must have been using a very hard wood to carve into, because all of these raised lines that were left on that wood block have been transferred very clearly. So this is a very different way of making a print. Looking at this portrait of Woody Guthrie here, when we look at this, everything that is black was remaining raised, and everything that is white has been carved away. And it was a very shallow carving, because you can still see some of the wood grain in Woody's face here that was left by that matrix made out of a wood block. Yet another way of making a woodcut. In this case, you really just have black and white, but everywhere that the black ink is, that was raised. Everything that was white has been carved away into the plate so that it doesn't transfer onto the paper. It wasn't long before we start to come up with machines to help us with the printmaking process. You might have heard of this one before. This is the Gutenberg press, and you can see some images in the side that were also created by making a wooden matrix and then carving away that material and then transferring that wood block onto paper. And it was done using this machine. You can see at the top image here where you've got some people who are cranking this lever that forces this vertical ram down, applies pressure, and makes that transfer of the block onto the paper. In the lower image, you can see some people, they have some stacks of paper in front of them. In this example, they're lining up all those pages, because think about it. If you were making a book and that book had 500 pages, you would carve the text into that block, and then do 500 printings of page 1. Put them all over here. When you go to page 2, make 500 copies of it, and then put them a sec, and so on, until you had all of your stacks of pages ready to bind them together into a book. This just advances as history goes on. This is the Wharfdale Press, coming out in the early 1800s. In this example, instead of a vertical jam or a vertical ram to press down and apply pressure from your plate onto your paper, in this case you're rolling it through, and this is much more similar to the types of presses that we have in the printmaking studio over at the school. You would pass both your matrix plate and your paper through this roller, and then that is going to apply even pressure over the surface and make it so that you have a transfer of that print. Now, the other terminology that we want to make note of for the printmaking chapter is registration. So not like registering for classes, but in this case, when you are using multiple colors, all of the examples we've looked at so far have been black and white. If you're using multiple colors, registration becomes important because you want to make sure that they're all aligned perfectly. So registration really refers to setting up some 90-degree lines on a piece of paper underneath your matrix and the paper that you're printing on. So this is going to make sure that every time you go in, if you have, like in this example, 3 different colors, you've got yellow, that darker brown, and then red that have been printed, you want to make sure that all of them line up. So each time you put your different colored matrix block down, it will line up with these lines, and every time you put that same piece of paper down, it's going to line up with these registration lines. So it's just making sure that when you print your red and then you go to put the yellow block down, that it is going to line up exactly where that red one did. With something like this, where you've got trees and leaves, it might not matter that much if it's a little bit off. But imagine if you were printing something with someone's face or an image that it really had to be exactly in the same place to look right and not look like you had misalignments occurring. This registration is quite important. So really, whenever we go to examine these pieces, we can just count the number of colors that are present, and that's how many matrix blocks were carved to transfer to one single piece of paper. So with this one, count them. You've got red and green, there's some purple in there, there's some darker green, maybe some yellow, probably around 5 different matrix blocks that were prepared, and they were all transferred evenly with the registration onto a single piece of paper. And then you start the next print. So again, with this one, just count it. We've got yellow, we've got black, we've got red, and green. So there's at least 4 different matrix blocks that were carved and then transferred onto one piece of paper. Now, slightly different from our wood block carving is wood engraving. The only difference in this case is the detail and the texture that's made, and that is because you are using a different side of the wood. Remember back to that Woody Guthrie portrait that we just looked at, where you could see some wood grain texture in the side of his face and his skin? They were using the long grain of the wood. So all of the texture that we were seeing is coming from this direction. You know how plants grow? They're always growing vertically, well, most of the time, and they have xylem. There are little strands that nutrients and water are brought up the plant, and that is through these little stems here. So we see them all when we cut a piece of wood and expose the end grain here. It's a different texture, and it makes a very different transfer whenever you're printing or inking it and then printing with it. It almost looks like stippling. You can see like little dots here. So many times, this one's coming from 1797. You've got examples of maybe scientists who were looking at plant life or animal life and wanting to make a book with all those species in there, and they wanted very, very detailed renderings. They would use the end grain in this wood engraving process instead of using the long grain to make a print out of. Still using carving tools, still removing what is not going to be printed and leaving raised what will transfer, but you have a very different look here, and it's much, much more detailed. So linoleum is exactly the opposite in that there is no texture at all. It's rubbery, it's flexible, it's much easier to carve than carving into wood. And whenever you look at this, there's no texture. I mean, it's either black or white. And the areas that will remain raised, that's where you have the black ink transferring, and where you've carved in and removed that linoleum, that is going to give you no transfer in the white areas. So you can call it lino cut, it's just short for linoleum, but here's an example. Some of you might have used this whenever you were in high school. They usually leave it till high school to start this process because you have to use very sharp carving tools. I still have mine from when I was in undergrad and took printmaking, and they're Niji, they're Japanese, they are kept really, really sharp, and that's important. You have a little sharpening stone and you grind that blade over it so that you make sure, especially when you're carving wood, that you don't have a dull tool and then end up skipping and either cutting an area that you didn't mean to on your block and messing it up, or slipping and cutting yourself, which can also be really dangerous. So the same is true. You can do multiple colors with linoleum, and what you've got to do is prepare multiple plates for each color. So one plate for the black ink, one for the green, and one for the brown and the skin tone. So we've got 3 different linoleum blocks that were prepared and then all printed onto the same piece of paper using registration to make sure that they are aligned. So here's our good friend Pablo Picasso. How many different linoleum blocks were prepared in this case to print this image? Count the colors: red, yellow, blue, and black. So we're using at least 4 different linoleum blocks to be able to make this print. Sometimes, not in all cases, you see the matrix and the paper final print displayed together. A lot of times you will not see that. Betisby Romero's work is an outlier here in that she uses a matrix of old tires, carves into them just like you would with linoleum or wood block, and then prints and displays them together. So you see both the matrix and the print. Here's just one more of them, where you've got obviously the matrix here. You can see where she's carved in to the tire itself to make that impression onto the paper here, and she likes to display them together. So seeing the carved matrix and then the print that results from rolling that over the surface. And sometimes she even displays them by themselves. In this case, you can just see how beautiful all of this floral design is that she's carved into the surface of those tires. So you could make a print with it, but she likes to display it on its own. So lithography. This is the next type of printmaking that we want to talk about. This is also something that we've been doing for several centuries at this point. You've got a word that we are somewhat familiar with if you break it down. Remember Neolithic and Paleolithic, litho being stone, lithography. So you're making a print with stone. In this case, you've got a very flat piece of stone, and Unlike with linoleum and woodcut where you're carving into the surface, in this case you're just putting the ink onto the surface of the stone. Um, it's operating as the definition defines, um, the principle that oil and water don't mix. So we're using a very greasy oil-based ink to make our design, and then putting water all over the surface of that stone. And that is so that when we pass it through the press and put a lot of pressure on it to make a good transfer, that we don't smear that ink and it spreads to areas that you don't want it to. Oil and water don't mix. So oil-based ink and the water on the stone keep the image exactly where you need it to be. So here's an image of one of those stone plates. Somebody's gone in, made all of their rendering on that plate, this little cat here, and then you place the paper over the top of it, roll it through the press, and this image is then going to transfer onto your paper. Here's yet another one, so you can see that you don't just have to have white or black. You can do some shading and get some areas of value, light to dark, with this process. Or you can use multiple colors, but the same thing is true. You have a different stone plate for each one of those colors. So count the colors and you can figure out how many plates were used to be able to make that print. Here's one more. You might have heard of him, Toulouse-Lautrec. We looked at one of his images earlier. He was, if you'll remember, one of Napoleon's royal artists that went along with him on military campaigns. When he gets done, he goes back to Paris and gets a job making flyers, basically, for shows that were going on at the time. Some of them at the infamous Moulin Rouge. But when we look at these, again, count the colors. That's going to be how many litho or stone plates were prepared with color, aligned with registration, and then printed. He couldn't, in the 1800s, go out to the copy store and get 500 copies of this ad made. He had to make them from scratch. So we've talked about relief and lithography, the top one and the middle one there. Now we want to move into intaglio. So intaglio is the opposite of relief, in that you can see with this little image here, you have the low-lying areas holding the ink. Instead of with our relief process that's a lot more intuitive, the raised areas you ink and then transfer. The question I get most is, well, if the ink is in these low-lying areas, how does it transfer to the paper? That answer is because of the printing press. Whenever we roll it through the printing press, we're putting a tremendous amount of pressure onto that paper. And in the process, the paper gets pushed down into these little low-lying areas, and then the ink transfers onto that paper. So there's multiple different types. Engraving, you've probably heard of. Dry point, mezzotint, etching you might have heard of also, but a lot of these are unfamiliar, aquatint and photogravure. The basic principle is how we see with etching, the first one, in that if you have a very shallow cut, a very light line that's been carved in, you're going to get much lighter, thinner lines. If you put a really deep cut into that plate, in this case most of the time it is either copper or zinc. So if you put a really deep gouge into that metal plate, you're going to have a lot of ink that'll be able to sit down in there, and you'll get a much darker line to transfer. But if you keep them really shallow, much more like scratches on the surface of that metal, you can have very, very light lines and have value from light to dark, almost like you're shading with graphite or charcoal with drawing media. So with engraving, you're using this tool here, the burin, and when you start to move the burin across the surface, in this case you're looking at copper, you are pulling up a burr. So it's really important to make sure that this burr-in tool is very, very sharp, so that that diamond shaped point that is making contact with the metal is sharp enough to really pull off a nice spiraling burr like that, and you'll get a good line that has been carved in that can hold ink and transfer it over to the paper. So these tools are what we're using to engrave with. You've probably seen engraving in some other applications. If you go up to the Philadelphia Art Museum, they have an incredible arms and armament room. In this case, many, many examples of engraved armor from the Middle Ages. So in this case, you weren't making a print out of it, you're just going in with those same burr-in tools and carving the design into the metal itself. Nobody was taking a piece of paper and trying to print with it, but that principle would work if you tried to do that with this armor. Here's yet another one where you've got some gold inlay there. Another example of engraving that you're probably handling all the time and maybe not even noticing it is our currency, our paper money, in that we have an example of something that has been engraved and then printed onto our paper money. In this case, you can see a little bit of a close-up of the engraved lines that were carved into the metal master copy that is then being transferred onto the paper that we use in the $1 bill here. So sometimes your engraving can be very smooth. Very smooth as far as the lines that are being created. In this image here, you can see the little steamboat that's out in the rough harbor there, using engraving into that metal plate to be able to create all the lines of the surface of the water here. Now, dry point is another one that we want to discuss. Dry point is using, instead of a burr-in tool to be able to carve that metal away, you're really just scratching into the surface with a sharpened steel needle. So dry point sounds like what it is. It's a pointed piece of metal. In this case, you can see the tool itself. This is a piece of copper, and really this artist has just gone in with that point on the needle and just scratched to make this design. So what do we have? We've got like a little bird. Then you would go over, put ink onto this surface, and then wipe it off. So you're removing it from all of these flat areas that have been untouched, and all the ink will remain only in those little scratches that you've placed to make your design, and then transfer over onto the paper. So you can see what happens here. This is a print that was taken from a dry point carving onto a metal plate, and only these areas where we have the lines present are what was scratched into that metal plate. The ink was then wiped off of the rest of the plate so that all of the rest of the image remains white, and you only have ink remaining in those areas that you've scratched into. Now, mezzotint was an advancement that we have in printmaking, and in this case we're not using a tool like a dry point needle or a burr-in to scratch or carve into the metal plate itself. In this case, you're just operating on the principle of texture. So with mezzotint, you will use a rougher and then also a smoother. I call it a burnisher in jewelry applications because this tool, that's a polished piece of steel, is used to smooth out those areas or burnish them back down, make them smooth. So what you're doing is using the rougher to make a texture out of the entire sheet, and this is copper also. The burnisher or the smoothing tool is then used to go back in and make those areas smooth. So what you're seeing is light reflecting off of these areas that have gone back in and been smoothed down. And all this serves to do is, in this area that has been roughed, the ink will stay. and the areas that have been smoothed out are going to be removed of any ink. So the ink will be held in these areas and will be absent in the areas that have been smoothed down with that burnisher. And that will make sure that whenever you transfer it over onto paper, you can control where the ink will transfer. But you can get a lot of detail with this, as you can see with this print that's been made at the bottom. So here's an example from the 1600s. You can see that we can get areas of value, light to dark, depending on how rough or how smooth the texture is on the surface of that copper, where the ink will stay. Now, etching, we are using a different process. In this case, it's chemical. We're not using a tool like a burnisher or a burr-in or a dry point needle. In this case, we're just letting a chemical make this impression onto the metal plate before we ink it and then transfer it onto paper. So etching uses a mordant. I use this in metalsmithing a lot. If you are trying to make a design onto the surface of metal, you can use a mordant like ferric chloride or nitric acid. They are acidic. So when you immerse your metal into this acid, it is eating away that material that is exposed. So how do you control the image that you make? You've got to be able to allow some areas to be eaten into by the acid and other areas to remain untouched. So you do this with the use of a resist. In classical printmaking and also metalsmithing applications, asphaltum is used. It's like a tar that you apply to the entirety of the surface here, and then you go back in with a tool similar to the dry point needle and scratch it away. You're not going in and scratching the metal itself like you would with dry point. You're just scratching off this resist on the surface. I've also used spray paint before. It works the same way in that you will spray the entire piece of metal so the whole thing is resisted, and then where I want my depressions to be, I'll go back in and scratch that spray paint off, make my design, and then immerse it into the acid bath. So in this example, everything that's black and still has asphaltum on it is going to remain untouched by the acid. It's resisted. The acid cannot get to the surface of the metal. Everywhere that you've gone in with that needle and scratched away and exposed this red copper underneath will be able to be touched by the acid. The acid will eat into it and make an impression so that this intaglio technique is possible. So I don't know how well you can see this, but this is an example of a piece of my work that I did the same thing, except instead of using a needle to scratch it away, I was using a laser cutter to remove that spray paint, burn it away, and then the acid could get to those exposed areas and then leave me with a design that I then turn into a piece of sculpture. You might be able to see some of those textures that have been transferred onto, in this case, sterling silver. But you can get a lot of detail, value, light to dark, with using hatching and cross hatching, as you see here, whenever you're carving that or scratching that resist away off of the copper sheet. Or it could just be a line that you exposed, etched, inked, and then transferred over to your paper. You're still preparing a matrix. Aquatint is slightly more complicated in that we've got multiple different values, light to dark, that have been represented here, but you're still using an acid to etch into this copper or zinc plate. So in this case, what you're doing is doing multiple baths in the acid. Each time you are etching some areas more deeply and some areas more shallow. So think about this as a microscopic view of the piece of paper or of the metal plate that you're starting with, and you will each time say this has been etched once, this has been etched twice, 3 times, 4 times. Each time you're etching it, you're getting deeper in those exposed areas, and it will hold more ink. So when you go back to be able to print this onto paper, the areas that are the most shallow will only hold a little bit of ink. Then the areas that are much deeper will hold a lot of ink, and you'll get a much darker impression. So all you really need to worry about for this one on the exam is that you are using etching to accomplish this aquatint technique. Here's yet another one where, in this case, you have burnished some of those areas, made them more smooth, but we're still getting multiple baths in the acid to get some areas deeper and some areas more shallow, so that you can control how much ink will be held and how dark it will be. With aquatint, though, you can also do multiple colors, but again, you have to have a separate matrix plate prepared for each one of those colors, and use registration to align it and make sure that when you print it, you have the exact same location. Photogravure is also an etching technique where we're using acid to eat into a metal plate, but in this case, this was the first one where we found the ability to be able to project a photo negative onto a light sensitive emulsion that is on the surface of that metal, and make prints or make a matrix plate that will print the likeness of a photograph. So this comes in handy in the 20th century big time, when we have the popularity of cameras just go through the roof, and then the ability for print media like newspapers or magazines to be able to take those images and make a plate that they can print into that media multiple times. So making copies, printed copies of a photograph. So this one is also quite complicated, using this light sensitive emulsion, exposing it to light, then some of those areas are going to harden onto the metal plate and make it so that you have the likeness of that photograph transferred once it's etched in the acid. Now, silkscreen, this is probably the most familiar to you. Anytime you have a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or some article of clothing that has a printed image on it in ink, you are using silkscreen. So your favorite t-shirt, as long as it's not embroidered, that's probably how the image was made. You don't have to do it onto fabric like your garments, but you can also do it onto paper. Now, there's a couple different terms used to describe this in the chapter. It's also described as serigraphy or silk writing, because the original material that we're using to make this plate or to make this matrix is silk. Now, in modern times, sometimes they're using synthetic fabrics to be able to do this, like a nylon, but it will work just the same if you're using a synthetic or a natural fiber like silk. The principle is that you have a frame which you stretch your silk or whatever fabric you're using over that frame, and then begin to work on your design. So what you will do is resist all of the rest of this fabric except where you want your image to come through. So once you go and put this over the paper and drag your squeegee over that with the ink, only the area that's unresisted is going to allow the ink to transfer through it and onto the paper. So if you didn't resist any of that fabric, all the ink would just come through and you would have a big block. But as you applied that resist to the fabric, preventing the ink to come through, the only areas where it's going to transfer is those areas of the fabric that have not been resisted. And again, with screen printing, you can do multiple colors, but what do you need? Multiple matrices, or matrices, I guess would be the proper terminology there, but just count the colors. You've got gray and black and red and blue. So you have at least 4 different matrix plates that were prepared, 4 different screens that were resisted and then printed. But you still need registration to make sure that everything is going to be aligned, right? Here's our friend Andy Warhol. You might remember these from the very beginning of the semester. We looked at his Mona Lisa prints, 30 or better than 1. Very similar with the screen prints that he's doing with Marilyn Monroe here. With this one, with black and white, you just have one screen that was prepared and then printed. So that one only using black ink. Once you have color, you can count to figure out how many screens he made to transfer that. So count them. You got yellow, you got pink, you got blue, and you got red for the lipstick. And that was a minimum of how many screens he had to prepare to be able to make this print. There's just one more produced with screen printing here. But again, the same is true. Count the colors, and that's how many screens or matrices were prepared to be able to make that print. Monotype is the last one. It is one that varies from the other process that we talked about, because in monotype you're only making one mono. In this case, whenever you're making a monotype, the times that I did it on a piece of plexiglass. So we could make a design, put it onto the paper, roll it through the press, and then have that ink transfer from the plexi onto my paper. But once you do that, the matrix that you prepare, just putting ink onto that smooth plexiglass, is destroyed. So you cannot make multiple copies of it. So many times, like with examples like this Enrique Chingoya, he has done one design on the plexi, rolled it through the press, and then transferred that design. Then he goes back in, puts more ink on it, make sure the registration is lined up, and then rolls it through again. And then does it multiple times. He's probably rolled this through half a dozen times with the same piece of plexiglass, each time having a different drawing on there. So it's hard to determine how many different plates he used, but he's definitely registering them and then rolling them through the press so that they are lined up with each other. Same like with this one. You've done one press with the ink being applied to the surface, and then when it comes out, the ink is all on the paper, so you'll apply some more ink to that plexi and then roll it through again. So probably only 2 or 3 pressings with this, but you're just using one singular matrix that each time gets destroyed, and you are not able to print multiple copies of this. You only end up with one final print at the end, hence the name monotype. Inkjet printing gets thrown in there in the end, and this is definitely one that we don't think about often for making art. It's more something that you just go to print out a research paper or what have you at the computer lab. But in this case, whenever we first start to see inkjet and laserjet come onto the market, artists are using this to make works with the very basic digital software that were available at the time. But you know how an inkjet works. You have a print head that is transferring ink line by line onto the paper and then giving you your image in the end. Now, what I want to discuss also is some outliers that are in this chapter. Marilyn Oliver here has been making sculpture that is also using printmaking, and in this case, with her works, she is taking images that are created with a CT scan. So going down through the layers of your body, she's taken 4 of her family members, had their entire body scanned, and then she's making prints of each of those layers on plexiglass, and then making all of them stand erect like we would see a real human. So you can't see this very well, but if you would go up to these figures and look into there, you'd be able to see these bronze prints that she's made onto that plexiglass of each layer of the body. So going down and seeing their organs and their bones, and it's really kind of eerie because it almost looks like there are people standing here, but there's nobody there. There's just these prints of images that were made with that medical device of the layers of their body here. Now, we can't leave the printmaking chapter without talking about 3D printing. Any of you that have been down to my office, you've probably seen my small 3D printer that I have sitting on my desk that I like to use sometimes. But this is the future of printmaking, and it is really still the same thing. Those of you that have used 3D printers before might have a concept of how it works, but it's similar to preparing a two-dimensional matrix in that you have slicing software that will take your object and break it down into its individual layers that compose it, so that whenever the 3D printer moves across the surface, it is drawing a design many times as it moves up through that object. So in this case, you can see they're making like a little bunny. You can fill the interior with support so that you make it a lot stronger and it's not just a hollow form. But all of that slicing software is doing is giving the print head a path to trace in layers. So one object might be 200 layers of print tall, and it's extruding various types of plastic filament. ABS or PLA, there's numerous other ones now as we move through the future. But what is important to remember is that there are objects that we can make with this technology that you would never be able to make in real life, just carving it by hand like we would with making a sculpture. So objects like this, yes, maybe you could try to make this and get close, but would you be able to do it in near the amount of time that we can with a 3D printer whenever we're going in and just having a sliced plan for the print head to print one of these objects out? So let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, I'm going to try and post one of these for each one of the chapters that we have for the rest of the semester. So the next one will be 9 on photography, and then we will do 11 on sculpture, 12 on the craft media, and then 13, our last chapter, on architecture. So I will see you on the next video. Make sure that you let me know if you have any questions about your presentation or your paper. The research assignment that is due, the deadline, as I said, is extended through the last day of classes, May the 11th. So I will see you guys on the next video. Thanks for watching.